Horror is a genre contingent on sound, whether it be a subtle patter of footsteps, a dripping tap, or an explosion of audio to accompany a jump scare. Since the addition of sound to film, audio has been at the heart of cinematic terror. But in 2018, John Krasinski's A Quiet Place was released, which turned this convention on its head, while still managing to make nail-biting tension out of its almost wholly quiet soundtrack. While some may argue that A Quiet Place isn't quite a horror, but more of a monster thriller, it's undeniable that it contains one of the most masterful and wholly encompassing use of cinematic sound in recent years. A Quiet Place's use of sound is fascinating for many reasons, but we're going to hone in on how it uses sound and silence to support and further its story. Cinematic sound often plays many roles in film. It can help deliver exposition through dialogue, give life to a world by pairing sound effects with actions, characters, creatures, or objects, instigate tension or emotion through drones and sound design, and create affect through a musical score, among many other things. Of course, sound is a medium unto itself, so watering it down to these 4 categories may feel a little reductionist, but broadly speaking, most cinematic sound can fit into one of these 4 categories. What's fascinating about A Quiet Place is that it almost wholly strikes the first item off the list, that of delivering exposition through dialogue. This obviously creates a pretty fundamental change to the nature of the film, given that much exposition in film is centered on dialogue interaction, something that was mentioned by the screenwriters of A Quiet Place, Scott Beck and Brian Woods, who explained, "Writing a silent movie isn't easy. You can't use dialogue as a crutch, and you can't bore the reader with blocks of descriptions." In other words, even the very first acts of writing such a script prove to be a challenge as they go against standard cinematic conventions. For this reason, let's take a closer look at the opening 10 minutes of the film, comparing script to screen, to dig deeper into what makes A Quiet Place's use of sound particularly exciting. The opening of any film is hugely important, as it acts to lower us into the themes, the world, and the narrative of the story, providing us with our bearings and rules of said world along the way. A Quiet Place's opening is a perfect example of this, and it achieves greatness due to its careful interaction between sound and visuals. The sequence unfolds with us meeting the family for the first time as they rummage through a crumbling abandoned shop. First we see the youngest son, then the daughter, older son, mother, and finally the father. The mother carefully pries a medicine container off his shelf. The characters look at each other quietly and slowly begin to sign, and, in a tense flourish, a plastic toy rocket falls and almost hits the floor, saved by the daughter who lunges out to grab it. At this point, as an audience member, we're already uncannily aware of the sound for a number of reasons. First of all, the characters are clearly averse to sound due to their sign language and efforts to avoid making any noise, empathetically making us already wary of what making a sound might mean. But secondly, we, sitting in the theater or at home, can also hear how quiet the film is. In the words of one of the film's sound designers, Eric Adal, this pulled the rug out from under the audience a little bit, because viewers are not used to having such a stripped down environment where they can hear themselves breathing in the theater, or hear themselves crunching on popcorn. This twofold confirmation of the importance of sound within the first 5 minutes manages to get us completely invested in the audio space, because it interacts with both the characters on screen and us in the audience in a very similar way. Just as they're aware of every minute sound around them, so are we. And as such, we're sucked right into their world, now unwilling to make sounds to disturb the audio silence. The sequence then progresses. The family exit the small town and comfortably head down some train tracks until the small rocket toy held by the youngest sounds off, breaking the eerie quietude we've experienced up to this point. Again, this interruption works on the same 2 levels. On the immediate level, the audience is caught off guard. This has been the only outstanding piece of audio yet in the film, and it comes in without a visual cue. In other words, we hear the audio before we see the toy going off. But on the narrative level, the characters also react with shock to this outlier of a sound, albeit a shock much greater than ours. What happens next goes to affirm our fear of sound, with a monster rushing out of the woods and clobbering the young boy in one swoop. Throughout the sequence, the whole narrative has been set up through sound and visuals alone, without relying on the crutch of dialogue for exposition. The filmmakers lower us into a keen awareness of sound, reflecting the reality of the characters before revealing the consequences of sound, making us acutely aware of all the noise that the film chooses to show us, and fearful of situations that might produce noise. Take this nail on the stairs that's accidentally propped up by Evelyn. On its own, the nail is an inconvenience, but given the context of the tragic loss we witness at the start, plus the fact that Evelyn was alone in the house, heavily pregnant, and about to give birth at any minute, the nail, along with her potential to scream after stepping on it, becomes a terrifying Chekhov's gun edged into our mind. But then comes the question, how exactly did the importance of sound in the film move from script to screen? Sound is an unusually difficult element to write, given its properties of often being quite tricky or tedious to describe. Within this sequence, there are a few key markers which highlight the importance of sound. Foremostly, the very first lines of the script read, "Black." We hear very clearly the sound of light wind, while the last line before the opening credits quietly reasserts, "The 4-year-old is gone." Once again, only the wind can be heard. Foregrounding sound as the very first and last elements in the sequence is obviously testament to its importance. But looking at another example, the all-important explosion of sound which causes the little boy's demise, we see something interesting. Let's take a look at the script in tandem with the scene. Head on, we walk with the father. Each member of his proud brood can be seen walking behind him. We can hear his strained breath and the tiniest swish of the footsteps in sand. Head on, walking with the daughter. We now suddenly hear nothing, as she looks to be in her own world, so we are in hers. A smile breaks on her face as she walks and breathes in total silence. We walk with her for a long moment, when suddenly behind her, a flickering red and blue light. The girl does not turn, she just keeps walking, still smiling. As she looks up to her mother, we go into slow motion. From the girl's POV, we see her mother and father spin around with a frantic shock on their faces. Back on the girl, she looks confused at her parents' behavior. Lights again flash eerily behind her. On the father, rushing to put the boy on the ground and turning to run. On the mother, spinning around with terror in her eyes. She looks to be holding in a scream. Back on the girl, slowly beginning to turn around at what her parents could be looking at as we speed back up to normal. A loud, playful beeping rushes in from the blinking shuttle. Then from the woods we hear the most unmistakable, horrifying screech. On the mother as she slowly lowers the backpack to the ground and her legs begin to fail her. On the father, running, violently shaking his head. It looks like he's holding in a scream. The trees behind them rustle and snap as something barrels through. On the boy, holding up his spaceship proudly to his incoming father, an enormous smile on his face. On the father, 20 feet away, his face is a still frame of pure fear as he runs to camera. Then, the most immediate and terrifying combination of sound one could ever imagine. A shriek, a scream, a crunch. Then, on the father as a thin line of blood splatters on his face. Mid-run, the father's body immediately goes limp, failing him as he comes to a halt just in front of camera. Then, as quickly as it came, the sound is gone. What's fascinating about this section of the script is that it seems to come in two parts. One which is almost wholly interested in the visuals, and then the final few lines which hone in on the all-important audio break. We could easily see this switch to slow motion and subsequent focus on the visual as the equivalent of audio silence which we experience in the final on-screen incarnation of the scene, but it actually goes one step deeper than this. As we heard within the scene, we seem to drop between a few different audio spaces while the rocket is playing. This can be explained by the film's interesting use of audio perspective. Audio perspective, like a POV shot in a film where we're looking through a character's eyes in the first person, is when we head from the perspective of a particular character or object. In this case, we jump from the perspectives of the hearing family and their hard of hearing daughter. By switching to the perspective of Reagan and dropping out the sound momentarily, the whole focus goes back to the visuals, which display the character's explosive reaction to this otherwise innocent sound. This again manages to successfully label sound, no matter how innocent it may seem, as something to be wholly feared. And once again, this is achieved without the use of any unnecessary exposition. It's entirely achieved through sight and sound. To use Eric Idle's words once again, what all of this foregrounding of even the slightest sounds did was, it made small sounds really big and really important. Forcing everyone in the cinema to remain in a near quiet state throughout the film had the potential to result in the audience falling asleep. But to remedy this, A Quiet Place makes great use of intermittent climaxes. The film goes from a quiet place, pun intended, and crescendos with the scene's tension to reach a peak where there would be an explosive climax of sound. But after that explosion, the film drops back down for a while and slowly creates another similar build. Take for example this. This pattern permitted the general quietude of the film to remain interesting and never get monotonous, as it was intersped by a variety of highly contrasting sounds which held a lot of narrative meaning. These climaxes also helped to mark a variety of key emotional moments of fear, worry, and great sadness. By only occasionally bringing sound up to its peak, Krasinski ensured that each moment of explosive sound was meaningful for both the narrative and the audience's reactions. A Quiet Place is quite a unique occurrence in the horror thriller sphere. It ties sound not just to fear or tension, but to every major narrative beat within the film, whether that be a moment of explosive sound or one of silent tension. In doing this, it's a perfect example of the potential sound has, not only in creating dynamic effect in the audience, but also in the process of storytelling itself. And after going through its script, it's clear such potential is only attainable when sound is considered from the very beginning of the project and woven right into the fabric of the film, which is why it's all the more poetic that sound, the thing our heroes are afraid of for most of the film, and the thing that we as the audience associate with danger, ends up becoming their saving grace.